Our last speaker today is Sara Aziz. She's a doctoral student in Harvard University's Near Eastern Languages and Civilization department. Her fields of interest include Islamic intellectual and cultural history, devotional literature, Shiism, and Sufism. Her research focuses on the early modern period in which she explores religious culture and intellectual exchange across the Ottoman and Safavid empires. She's particularly interested in the role of prayer literature as a site of scholarly reflection and debate that cuts across linguistic and confessional divides. Sara received her master's degree in Islamic studies from the University of Chicago Divinity School in 2019, and her BA in religious studies with honors in 2017 from Davidson College.
Thank you for having me and for this wonderful conference. Today I will be speaking about my paper. The title of my paper is Beyond Pathos, Perspectives on Suffering from the Supplications of al-Sahifat al-Sajjadiyyaand. I'll start now. So a perennial question and a recurrent theme within the Quran and within that has been treated across all spheres of Islamic thought. The question of suffering also is a major question when it comes to the relationship between man and God and shaping that. Sorry, have you already started sharing the screen? Is it okay? Can you see or? Sorry, I just noticed. I can't because I can't see you and. Oh, okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay, I'll start. I guess I'll continue. So we have seen so far that the question of suffering and affliction has been treated in its theological, ethical, and philosophical dimensions have been discussed by Muslim thinkers and scholars. But one area or one genre that naturally deals with the theme, but which has not received much study, is that of prayers and supplications known as dua. One of the foremost examples or the main examples of dua relating to suffering are in the Quran. So for instance, the Quranic narratives of prophetic trials are punctuated by pithy prayers like those of Job, Ayub, who cried unto his Lord, affliction has struck me and you are the most merciful. Or Nuh, who entreated to God, I am overcome, so give help. Similar to these prayers, which have become standard among Muslims and in the Islamic tradition, a particular genre, a full genre of supplications, varying in length, from pithy prayers to lengthy compositions composed by revered and pious figures in both prose and verse, known as dua or munajat, which literally means whispered or private conversations, to denote intimate communion with God. These supplications express and embody the religious sensibilities in devotional language, giving us insight into very personal dimensions of the religious response to affliction. In this paper, I turn to a canonical collection of supplications known as al-Sahifat al-Sajjadiyyaand, or the Scroll of al-Sajjad, attributed to Ali ibn al-Hussein Zayn al Abidin, who died in 1712 or 1713, who was the Prophet's grandson and the fourth Imam of the 12 Shia and the third Imam of the Ismaili Shia. I translate, annotate, and analyze two of Zayn al Abidin's supplications that deal with the themes of affliction. The first deals with the theme of affliction, and the second with illness in particular. And my analysis will show that how these supplication texts really complicate the notion of petitionary prayer beyond a simple petition answer that some might think would be rooted in pathos. Rather, I will show that that these texts serve as contemplative texts that integrate the teachings of the Quran and the Hadith with an aim to reshape and reframe one's conception of what suffering is through a shift in consciousness in the believer or in the supplicant, in view of notions of taslim or submission and tawhid. And in doing so, they really give us show us what could be some of the earliest examples of reflective responses to suffering and affliction in Islamic literature. I'll say a couple of more words about, before going to the supplications themselves, I'll say a couple more words about Zayn al Abidin, the author, or the person they are attributed to, and the Sahifa itself as a text. So as implied by his epithets, Zayn al Abidin, which means ornament of the worshippers, and his other epithet, al-Sajjadiyyaand, which means the ones constantly prostrating before God in prayer, Ali ibn al-Hussein was a paragon of piety and devotion. Muslim biographers and hagiographers almost unanimously report that a Badr Hashemite was not seen, and acknowledge him as a pioneering teacher of the art of prayer and supplication in the Islamic tradition. In addition to the Sahifa text that we have, hadith, akhbar, and manaqib literature and other eclectic literary and historical texts contain numerous prayers and invocations attributed to him. So the Sahifa, turning to the Sahifa, it's a collection of 54 supplications composed in rhymed prose, what in Arabic is called sajh, and it is arguably the oldest prayer manual in Islamic sources. The text is transmitted widely and it has a mutawatir status in the 12-er tradition. And although a critical study of the Sahifa has not been undertaken yet, scholars have maintained a pretty certain view about authenticity, at least asserting an authentic core. Scholars who have the text, for instance, like William Tick, by analyzing the language and the themes and the literary style, they all seem consistent with what we know of Zayn al Abidin and what the tradition itself upholds. So the question of this is, I just wanted to mention that in case one wonders, but looking deeper into the Sahifa, it's thematically in these thematically diverse prayers. Zayn al Abidin offers divine praise, thanks, and supplicates for divine blessings on various occasions of religious significance, and seeks forgiveness and aid during times of need. The Sahifa itself is important both as a document or a text that shows us Zayn al Abidin's own spiritual and devotional, sheds light on his devotional and spiritual sensibilities, but also as a text of his preserving his teachings, and in that sense, it is also prescriptive. So, and this, we get a sense of this from the Sahifa itself, and as its own transmission narrative tells us that Zayn al Abidin dictated its contents to his son Muhammad al-Baqir, suggesting that the Sahifa was meant to be preserved and passed down. And in so many ways, the tradition presents it as the supplication text par excellence. It is called the Psalms of the House of Muhammad, or Zabur Ali Muhammad, and the Gospel, or the Gospel of Ali Muhammad, and also the sister of the Quran, owing to its Quranic underpinnings and its beautiful literary style. Particularly in relation to suffering, by virtue of its contents and context, the Sahifa has much to offer to the question and what we come to think and how the attitude towards suffering. Its supplications address hardship, both broadly defined and in particular instantiations such as death, illness, or falling into reduced means. The perspective from within which the Sahifa treats this theme is also unique. By virtue of their early provenance, these prayers precede theological kalam discussions and their technical considerations, offering us first-hand insights from a personal yet deeply religiously informed perspective. This personal perspective is all the more significant given Zayn al Abidin's own status as a revered spiritual figure, but also his life experiences as a witness and survivor of the tragic Battle of Karbala, about which we will hear later today from Professor Boylston. The tragic Battle of Karbala, Zayn al Abidin was the only survivor, male survivor of the family of the Prophet. And so, in as much as he was a paragon of piety, he was also a living symbol of trials and afflictions. The sources report that he was in a state of constant sorrow following this calamity, and that this calamity lived on through regular lamentations and poetic commemorations that he oversaw and held, which also remain until today. And now turning into the turn to the supplications. So maybe the text, before going to the supplications, I wanted to mention that the Sahifa has been translated by Professor William Chittick in a very beautiful translation. Here I offer my own translation, but I wanted to show the text because it's very beautiful, and he did everyone a favor by really translating this text. So it's the one that you saw, the blue one. So now you'll turn to the text. Before looking at the particular supplications, we should know that the Sahifa exhibits this as something very simple about the supplication genre, but also complicates it a bit. So Islamic supplication on a fundamental level are based on or echo the structure of the Fatiha, the opening surah of the Quran, which divides into praise, tahmid, and petition, dua. And following the progressions of the movements of the supplication in the Sahifa, we see the same thing. We discern a similar anatomy, but with some differences here and there, mostly additions, as we will see. So now I turn to supplication number 1, which is the 7th supplication that designates Zayn al Abidin's prayer during times of difficulty, distress, and misfortune. Yes, I think you can see it on the screen now. So the prayer can be divided into 3 main parts: a laudatory vocative, reflective complaint, and petition. And we shall turn into each of these parts in order. The first screen that you see is the laudatory vocative. And here, Zayn al Abidin's prayer during hardship begins with a thematized triple vocative addressed to God in the 3rd person, and which foreshadows the supplication's main themes, establishing what the medieval critics call an ingenuous exordium, or bara'at al-istihlal. From the outset, the prayer tempers the focus on the calamity itself. He says, "O he through whom the knots of detested matters are untied. O he through whom the cutting edge of hardships is blunted. O he from whom the outlet onto the refreshment of relief is begged. Difficulties yield to your power, means come to be through your subtleness. What is decreed comes to pass through your power. The affairs proceed according to your will. By your desire without your word, they are commanded. By your will without your prohibition, they are constrained. You are the one called upon in worries, and the place of light in misfortunes. None of them is repelled unless you repel it. None of them are removed unless you remove it." In Arabic, this is, again, as I mentioned, a rhyming prose. So now let's take a closer look at these opening verses. From the outset, the prayer tempers the focus on the calamity itself through the 3 images of the vocative, namely untying the knots of difficulty, blunting the cutting edge of hardship, exiting into the refreshment of relief. Zayn al Abidin implicitly praises God as the problem solver par excellence, semantically through the images, and structurally by systematically placing resolution before hardship. The opening address renders the very orientation towards God a way to relief. The anticipation of resolution, however, is not wishful, rushed, or abstract, but rooted in an understanding of God's transcendence. Sustaining the implicit praise of the opening lines, verses 2 and 3 proceed with a laudatory reflection upon God's absolute power, qudra, which we see repeated a few times, and will, irada or mashia. A profusion of past tense verbs, which in Arabic imply enduring habit, emphasize God's established command and control over the affairs of the world in a matter-of-fact manner. The supplicant consciously recognizes both affliction and its reversal as matters of divine decree, indicating not only his sense of awareness, but also a sense and submission, but also a sense of wonder. In voicing this recognition of God's will, the prayer implies an attitude of faithful resignation and contentment that, in a sense, checks the forward-looking and resolution-oriented vocative. The laudatory vocative culminates in verse 4 which in further contemplating God's transcendence asserts his immanence. The verse here simultaneously re-emphasizes God's exclusive power in turning the tides and alleviating difficulties through a restrictive construction, which you can see that none except that is repeated, and using explicit second person pronoun, you, invoking God as the one called upon mad'u and the place of flight and refuge mafza, during hardships creates an imminent sense of directed movement towards God, underscoring his proximity. So we can see here that the prayer defines the beginning and end of calamity in relation to God's will, and also paves the way for the subsequent complaint and plea through an appeal to his proximity. So embracing then these two possibilities, or these with a hand towards divine transcendence and hand towards divine eminence, the prayer proceeds to issue a complaint and a plea. All right, so now we can take a look at the second slide. Okay. The second segment of the prayer ushers in Zayn al Abidin's complaint or shakwa, voiced in light of the opening reflection. Using the intimate, "Oh my Lord, Ya Rabbi," Zayn al Abidin complains of an affliction whose weight burdens and whose carrying oppresses. I'll read the verses. "My Lord, upon me has come down a matter whose weight burdens me, and I have been overtaken by something whose carrying oppresses me. Through your power, you have brought it down upon me, and through your authority, you have directed it towards me. No one can send away what you have brought. No one can repulse what you have directed. No one can open what you have closed. No one can close what you have opened. No one can make easy what you have made difficult. No one can help him whom you have forsaken." Zayn al Abidin complains of an affliction whose weight burdens and whose carrying oppresses. The verse of complaint, however, strikes us with a certain sense of sobriety. Zayn al Abidin uses Quranic image that depicts both the physical and non-physical dimensions of suffering through the image of a heavy physical burden. In verse 94, 1-3 in Surah Al-Inshirah, God rhetorically asks the Prophet, "Have we not expanded your chest and removed your burden, which weighed down your back?" More expressly, the complaint evokes the Quranic plea, "Our Lord, burden us not with what you have, but with what we have no capacity to bear." And thus necessarily also the declaration preceding it, God does not task a soul beyond its capacity. The use of the image, which in the first Quranic instance appears accompanied with the resolution, and in the second one is posited in relation to divine justice, thus carries with it a sobering cues that seem to guide the complaint. Furthermore, Zayn al Abidin expresses the discomfort of burden, but does not dwell on it. Verse 6 almost seems to cut short the complaint with a statement recognizing the affliction as a sign deliberately sent by God, manifesting divine power, qudra, and sovereignty, sultan. This seeming cutting short, however, does not reduce the claim, but rather measures it, ultimately helping the supplicant see through it. That is, it orients it in relation to the view that the very divine power and will that bring about the calamity lead to relief. And in a sense, this move within the prayer performatively symbolizes the very ethos and objective of the prayer. By tracing the calamity back to God, it tempers the focus on the calamity, and relativizes it in relation to a broader perspective. In that sense, the prayer itself embodies the Quranic verse, which Professor Zargar had mentioned yesterday, "Those who, when hit by calamity, say, we belong to God and to him we shall return." We can see this movement of returning back to God through the very act, or through the prayer itself in its shift between the verses. Verse 7 reinforces this sense of sobriety through these 6 negative statements that we see, emphatically precluding the possibility of opposing or altering divine will or action, thus leaving all possibility of resolve with God. Again, the directness of these matter-of-fact statements reinforces the one-pointed orientation towards God while implying an attitude of faithful resignation, augmenting the appeal of the ensuing treaty. So now, can you get this the third slide? The transition into the third and final movement of the supplication is marked by the invocation of blessings upon the Prophet and his family. And I shall read it. So, blessed Muhammad and his family, open for me, O my Lord, the door of relief with your graciousness. Break off from me the authority of worry with your strength. Look upon my complaint with the beauty of your gaze. Let me taste the sweetness of your favor. In what I ask, grant me mercy of your own and wholesome relief, and make for me from yourself a quick way out. Distract me not through worry from observing your obligations and from following your prescriptions. My capacity has been straitened by what has befallen me, O my Lord, and I am filled with worry but by carrying what has happened to me. You have the power to remove what has afflicted me and to repel that into which I have fallen. So do that for me, even though I may not deserve it from you, O possessor of the mighty throne. So the beginning with the benediction upon the Prophet is a stable feature of the Sahifat supplications that appeals to the Prophet's intercessory function, acknowledging him as an essential link between the believer and God. As the commentators note, the benediction is cast in trust that God, who inevitably grants the prophetic blessings, would also answer the believer's petition to follow. In many ways, the multi-pronged petition reflects the consciousness cultivated through the prayer's initial guiding meditation. Zayn al Abidin's petition for relief is not built around aggrandizing his own suffering or dwelling on it. Rather, it draws on God's strength, mobilizing the meditation on divine transcendence. Zayn al Abidin invokes the divine invokes God through the divine name al-Qadir. Here, however, posited not so much as the divine name, but he tells him, you are the powerful, and entreats God to open the door for relief, break the authority of worry, and remove and repel affliction, ultimately sealing his plea with the Quranic epithet, possessor of the mighty throne, the epitomic image of divine omnipotence. The petition draws upon God's strength and power, highlighting by contrast the supplicant's vulnerability, but not leaving him in a weak standpoint. Again, he also reissues his complaint through another Quranic expression, my capacity has been straitened, evoking the image of a burden that impedes movement. The supplicant, as we can see, is not consumed by the immediate experience of suffering, but rather sees through it and beyond it. Zayn al Abidin stresses worry or ham and ihtimam, worry's domineering quality, sultan, and its debilitating effects. Nevertheless, he still looks beyond it with an eye to its repercussions, particularly on his spiritual welfare as concerns the dutiful fulfillment of his obligations towards God. So we see here how the prayer, in a sense, channels the first initial meditation into a position of strength, into leaving the supplicant in a position of strength. So now I want to quickly turn to the second supplication, which is dedicated to illness. I'm not sure is the time I have counting the delay or not? Do I have time? Okay.
Yes, I counted the delay.
Okay. So quickly looking at supplication number 2. Similar to the previous supplication, this one starts by tempering the focus on the calamity itself. Not only does Zayn al Abidin begin his prayer during times of illness by praising God, saying, "Oh God, praise be to you for the good health that has been in my disposal, and praise be to you for the ailment you have inflicted on my flesh." But he also praises him for the ailment he brought about. In positing illness in continuity with health, he challenges the normative dichotomous view, which posits illness and health as opposites using a simple positive-negative value judgment, foreshadowing the main themes and perspective of the prayer, and yet another example of an ingenuous exordium. In a way, an extension of the opening line, the second segment of the prayer, verses 2 to 5, I think we can move past, yes, so you can see, yes, this one, and then I read that one, the one after. Yeah, the verses 2 to 5 commentate upon the seemingly perplexing exordium. In intimate communion with God, Zayn al Abidin exclaims, "For I do not know which of the two states merits greater thanks to you, nor for which is praised prior. Is it times of good health during which you have indulged me with the delights of your provision and given me joy through which to seek your good pleasure and bounty, and given me strength to perform acts of obedience which you have given me success to accomplish, or times of illness through which you test me and the favors you bestow, lightening the offenses which have weighed down my back, washing away the misdeeds into which I have plunged, and alerting me to turn to repentance, and reminding me of your ancient favor to erase my sins. And throughout it all, what the two writers write down for me, righteous acts, what neither heart has pondered, nor tongue has uttered, nor limb has undertaken, rather all out of your magnanimity and benefaction towards me." Suspending judgment on account of limited knowledge, he expresses wonder at the very notion of deeming one state more meritorious or praiseworthy than the other. With an eye to their spiritual import, his reflective rhetorical question ultimately implies that both indeed equally deserve thanks and praise. For him, the vigor of good health makes possible enjoying God's provisions and acting in obedience to him. Illness, on the other hand, is a trial that purifies, redeems, and reminds one of God's bounties, reorienting the heart towards God in repentance. Zayn al Abidin portrays illness as a redemptive experience and a sign of God's grace. Verse 4 refers to the trials of illness as blessings or favor bestowed by God to lighten the offenses that weigh down the back. Here, we see the image of the heavy burden again, which, as we saw in the previous prayer, was used to denote affliction, is used to highlight the weightiness of sins and misdeeds accrued during his life and felt down by the illness, thus implying that the true affliction is not the illness itself, but the burdensome misdeeds accrued in life. The verse evokes the hadith of the Prophet that states that illness does not befall a Muslim except that God brings down his sins like a tree sheds its leaves, and a similar saying of Ali in the Nahj al-Balagha. Moreover, Zayn al Abidin expresses that illness, through its very occurrence, erases the misdeed of negligent forgetfulness towards the ancient favor, which here refers to health. In addition to being redemptive, illness figures as a manifestation of divine grace and magnanimity. Verse 5 echoes a hadith according to which God instructs the angels to continue counting the believers' acts of worship and good deeds during times of illness, just as during times of health. The reflection preserves the similar sober and matter-of-fact quality observed in the previous prayer. The continuity between health and illness takes place on the level of their contribution to spiritual welfare. It is worth noting that the prayer does not present the silver lining of illness or view it as a blessing in disguise. In other words, it does not tell us illness is bad, but look on the other side. Rather, the reflection is straightforward, comfortably asserting a single-pointed view of illness that is informed by its redemptive function. In fact, the single-pointedness is so total that we do not find a complaint within this particular prayer. Underpinned by the hadith of the Prophet, the supplication appears as a witness to an attitude shaped by a deeply internalized religious teaching. The final segment of the prayer, if we can turn to the last one, Zayn al Abidin invokes blessings upon the Prophet again, paving way for his plea. His petition is not just a mere entreaty for resolution, but a series of reflective requests that affirm the preceding commentary. The multi-pronged plea seems to progress over 4 stages, which resemble a timeline of reception, experience, and aftermath of the ailment. First, I'll just read it quickly. So he says, "So bless Muhammad and his family, make me love what you have approved for me, make easy for me what you have brought down upon me, purify me from the defilement of what I have sent forward, wash away from me the evil of what I have committed beforehand, make me find the sweetness of good health, make me taste the coolness of safety, Make my way out of illness lead to your forgiveness, my way away from infirmity to your forbearance, my escape from calamity to your grace, my safety from this hardship to your relief. So here, first, Zayn al Abidin prays not just for an attitude of contentment, but of loving what God has approved for him. In a sense, contentment seems to be implied already by the very lack of a direct complaint in the prayer. The plea makes clear that the prayer does not seek to deny the experience of suffering, however. Turning towards the experience of affliction, he pleads, make easy for me what you have sent down upon me. Then, embracing an attitude of acceptance and recognition, he prays for purification and redemption through it. Anticipating the end of trial, and he uses the vivid sensory images and entreats God for recovery. Make me find the sweetness of well-being, comparing health to a lost pleasure and safety to a cool drink. Make me taste the coolness of safety. Finally, looking beyond the illness, he anticipates where it leads, reinforcing an active sense of movement. The last four pleas that we see, he pleads that for a complete sense of separation from the ailment, and affliction leads towards God's forgiveness, forbearance, refreshment, and relief. It is worth noting that the four destinations mark aspects of physical and spiritual relief, reinforcing the continuity between the physical and spiritual stressed at the beginning of the prayer, and thus bringing into full circle the supplication's reorienting perspective. So we can still see him here by the end invoking the calamity, voicing the calamity, using illness, infirmity, distress. So it is not a denial of the experience, but a choice of where to orient and interpret. So here we see that now, I don't know, am I over time? Yes, okay. I'll just say a final word of conclusion. I just wanted to, through this close reading for us to shed light and see how these prayers work through their building a reflection first, building a meditation, and then how it proceeds. And what we can see, although both are not the same, they are different, but they still work with a similar attitude and emerge from the same perspective. We see the main points I want to highlight is that these prayers first try to temper, and first response is to temper the focus on affliction, qua calamity itself that is rooted in a worldly and sensory experience. And in that sense, it is reflective rather than reactionary. In this attitude, we see an instantiation of what Professor Chittick remarks, what he says in his introduction to the Sahifat, that from the beginning of Islam, supplication has been one of the fundamental modes through which Muslims actualize the awareness of correct proportions and train themselves to see God as the source of all good. In the two supplications we read together, we see this shift or this effort to highlight correct proportions. And here everything posited in relation to ultimately spiritual welfare and what bears spiritual benefit. And we can see how the prayer is not simply a simple I want petition, but rather it seeks through and through to cultivate an attitude of contemplativeness that creates a shift in consciousness that makes you always view affliction, whatever its kind might be, against the background of divine will and the attitude of submission, which is fundamental to Islam or the Islamic perspective. And in so the very sobriety we see it combines both intimacy but also sobriety, and in a way that reflects the Prophet's emblematic prayer, our Lord, make us see things as they are, Rabbana arina al-ashya'a kama hiya. So with this, I just want, I'm sorry if I think I went a bit over time, but I think
No problem. Thank you so much, Sara, for a wonderful end to a great panel. The questions I see here, first of all, is can you expand on the concept of wonder in prayer in the midst of calamity?
Sorry, could you
wonder? Can you expand on the concept of wonder in prayer in the midst of calamity?
Oh, so I think I mentioned wonder in relation to the prayer, in relation to seeing affliction as a manifestation of God's. In this particular prayer that I mentioned, it was seeing affliction as a manifestation of God's power and will, and the here, like the believer's position or the supplicant's position that we see is one of seeing not getting stuck in the particular or in the particular calamity in so far as it's physical or sensorial weight, but turning it to God. You see, there is a wonder. There is a wonder when you see an earthquake. I mean, it's calamitous. It's not, it's not, it's problematic from our perspective. But there's also wonder at how these things come about. But this wonder only happens with a particular orientation, which here we might perhaps think is maybe too stark, too strong, too idealistic, but the prayer shows that such a thing does exist, just depending on your perspective.
Great, thank you so much. I will read just one more question. You can also see the questions there.
Yeah, could you comment?
So it is, could you comment in more detail on difference between will and a speech in section 3? And it's more about the distinction. Is there any similarity between this and distinction of it that Ibn Arabi makes between the ontological command and the legislative command?
Could you comment on more detail on the difference? So section 3 of, maybe starting in person. Sorry, section 3 of the first prayer. Or
Nicholas, would you like to clarify? Yes, he says yes.
Okay, 1 second. The first prayer. Okay, so section 3, which you mean the verse 3, or section 3, the last section, the third segment? Sorry, I'm asking him more questions.
Verse 3.
Okay. Oh, I see. So yeah. So I think what the verse here is doing is let me just read his question again. We can't comment in more detail. Okay, so I think will and speech. The verse says that it is so. Yes, so that the very command. So if we place command as preceding the very word gets voiced, but it seeks to yeah, I guess that's right, ontological command and the legislative command in Ibn Arabi. So I think that would be something actually that's helpful for me to look into and maybe integrate. But yes, I think yes, it's not a question, it's more, yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone.